summer's out, but can you listen on?
A couple of summers ago, I was working at a summer camp in the Midwest. My position wasn't exactly of a counselor, but more of an assistant. I was training to become a counselor, and there's a requirement of at least a half summer as this assistant counselor position. I loved camp, though. I'd been going since I was 9, so I didn't mind the low pay, lots of paperwork, and honestly low recognition for our efforts. One day, I was on my way to the equestrian area of camp. The skills we teach come out of a lottery system, and I got stuck with horses despite a clear lack of interest or expertise with them, when I ran into a kid in a hoodie, crouched on the side of the pathway. I was running late myself, so I mentioned to him that he should hurry up so that he doesn't miss the roll call at skills and instigate a camp-wide Amber Alert. He didn't respond. And on top of that, did something weird and incredibly disgusting. He picked up what looked like a worm off the ground and ate it. Just slurped it up like it was spaghetti. I freaked out and ran over to him to get it out of his mouth, but by the time I got to him, his mouth was empty. I turned on him and incredulously asked why he would eat a worm. His previously expressionless face changed into a creepy smirk and said,
"I just needed a snack."
"Well, you just had breakfast."
There wasn't food enough for both of us.
This was odd, but I just assumed he was talking about another camper and himself. I resigned to walking him to his next skill after radioing in about how I was going to be late to the corral. I also made a mental note to remind the kid's counselor to make sure his kids are eating enough since at least one was resorting to eating bugs. A couple of days passed with nothing weird going on. When walking back from planning an activity for the next day, I came across a pile of shit. I would have ignored it, but for the fact that it looked human. Trying to suppress my exasperation with the fact that there was a bathroom not 50 feet away, I gave a sigh and was about to report the pile of crap to janitorial when I noticed there were bits of white in it. Curious, but with an obvious sense of apprehension, I approached the feces and gave it a closer look. I almost lost my lunch right there. The bits of white speckled in the crap were small animal bones. I hope to whatever deity exists that there were chicken bones from our dinner several nights ago, but they were much too small. My disgust deepened when I noticed a skull. It was quite clearly a mouse skull. I sat there thinking, what the hell could make a kid eat a mouse, when I realized that there were some bones that clearly weren't mouse bones. They were much too long for a mouse. Then my memories of biology class kicked in. These bones I was noticing were from a bird's wing. Using a stick, I searched for the skull, but I found none. I was still quite sure it was a bird's wing. I radioed the janitorial staff and the camp director. The director was clearly disturbed by my finding, but he told me to keep it quiet and had the janitorial staff dispose of the excrements. At dinner that night, the director made an announcement about diet, and that if somebody felt they weren't getting proper nutrition, they should consult their counselor. He slipped it in among other announcements as to not raise suspicion, but the comment still got a fair amount of raised eyebrows from counselors. That night, I was walking back to my cabin after our evening activity when I ran across the camper that ate the worm, again, in a hoodie. I quipped jokingly, "Hey! You find anything tastier than worms yet?" He gave me a matter-of-fact look and said,
"Yes, actually. Rodents are much more filling than worms."
A cold pit formed in my stomach. Trying to roll with the punch, hoping it was a joke, I responded, "Really? They don't sound that appetizing," I managed to mutter.
Well, better than birds. Much too bony.
I was slowly walking backwards at this point. I didn't respond, considering I was scared shitless. What was even scarier was that he advanced as I retreated.
We've been getting really hungry lately, though. We need a real meal. We think we'll move up the food chain, maybe to the top.
I turned to run, but before I got 3 steps, I felt the kid leap onto my back and sink his teeth into my right shoulder. I screamed in pain, falling to the ground. I attempted to reach around my back, trying to get him off. Finally, I felt a small portion of my flesh give way, and the kid fell backwards, taking some of me with him. I screamed even louder and turned on him. He was sitting there, smiling, his face smeared with my blood, chewing on my skin. He charged at me again. On my back this time, I kicked him straight in the chest, sending him backwards into a tree. He hit the ground and stopped moving. I checked my shoulder quickly, and while my shirt was soaked in blood, the bleeding didn't seem too bad. I then turned to the kid. I approached him cautiously, wincing whenever I moved my shoulder too much. Once I reached him, I stumbled back in horror. After hitting the tree, the hood came off his hoodie, and I could see the back of his neck. On it was this bright yellow and orange bug. It was like a huge but short centipede, about 9 inches long and 1.5 inches wide, with small exposed soft spots that appeared on its back every inch or so. One of these was punctured and leaking gray ooze. I'm assuming the aggressive contact with the tree caused it. It seemed to have a head, but if it did, it was buried deep in the kid's neck, just below the nub of bone on the back of the skull. As I reached for the kid's jugular to check a pulse, he suddenly twitched. I shot backwards, my nerves all but gone. He then got up, gave me this inhuman snarl, and ran into the woods. I radioed in for help, and once several counselors, a nurse, and our director arrived, I told them the whole story while the nurse patched me up. They didn't seem to believe me, but they also couldn't seem to explain the chunk of flesh missing from my shoulder. The bite definitely didn't look like it had come from any animal nearby. Just to check, the nurse swabbed the bite and said she would send it into a lab to get some results on what attacked me. She finished with the bandage, and we quickly started a camp-wide search for that little camper. He never turned up. Adding up the fact that I was the last to see him and the crazy story I recounted, most of the blame fell to me. I was sent home on suspension, and they said there would be a formal hearing. I got a call to come in a week later to see the director. This was uplifting since disciplinary action was usually settled with the board of directors, usually just heavily involved parents of campers. The director's expression wasn't happy, though. He said they never found the kid, but the test came back with odd results. He wouldn't elaborate, but he went on to say that I was being let go. On the plus side, he said I'd be paid for my full stint there, which didn't end for 3 more weeks. He made some bullshit reasoning that I wasn't what the camp was looking for in their counselors, and that it wouldn't work out. In my years as a camper, he always mentioned that I would be a great counselor, and he was the main reason I was trying to become one. I could obviously tell that he was told to say all this, but I didn't want to push it and get too involved, so I thanked him for the fun years at camp, and I left. After a lot of therapy, I stopped thinking and dreaming about it. Since then, only a couple odd things have brought up memories. I asked my doctor for my medical history when applying for college, but he found my medical examination after the camp incident gone. I did a web search and found that the camp director left camp shortly after I did. I don't know if he joined a different camp or just got out of the camp business entirely. Some camp friends still contact me, but it was never the same as before the incident. I still have a scar, but it has faded a lot compared to when the bandages came off. Now I'm about to enter my senior year of college this coming fall, and truthfully, I had not thought about this story for several years until one of my close friends whom I told the true story pointed me towards this site. If somebody has ever heard of anything like this, please contact me.
After high school, I went to work at this summer camp up in backwoods Ontario. If you're not from Ontario and have never been, just understand that after a certain point, the whole province is just deep woods that basically go on forever. It's all just pine trees and quiet lakes, most of which have no people around for miles. The camp has been running out of my hometown for years. It mostly services kids with behavioral and emotional problems, usually from bad or at least very poor homes. It gives them a chance to experience a good summer and lets them get away from home for a while. It's super low budget though, and is just basically a couple of buildings out in the middle of nowhere on our own private lake. So this camp is really old and has lots of traditions, one of which is a now somewhat infamous ghost story. It's too long to tell here, but essentially what happens is that two brothers who trapped furs in the area 150 years ago fall for the same woman, and after getting into a drunken fight, the jealous brother accidentally decapitates the other with an axe. After hiding the body, he is haunted by the ghost and eventually dies from a heart attack, while the now widowed woman waits in the woods for her dead husband in her wedding dress until mysteriously disappearing, leaving only a bloody dress behind in a tree. We tell this story near the end of the week and set up a scare for the kids. It's a bit sadistic, but it's all in good fun, and the kids get over it. Most come back to volunteer at the camp and help scare the new kids. Now, the day before this story is told, the kids all go out with their counselors and have an overnight sleeping trip in the woods. We obviously save the story for later, since there's no way you'd spend a night in the woods after hearing it. I was a lifeguard at the camp, so I stayed behind with a couple of others to respond to any health emergencies that happened on the trips. All that usually happens is a kid gets stung by a bee or gets sick and has to spend a night in the infirmary. Nothing really serious. Not usually. On the second last week of the summer, the kids all went out on a trip, and I stayed back, same as any other week. The four of us who stayed back were sitting in the mess hall playing cards and chatting, when a call came over one of the radios. It was from one of the campsites on the water. The sites are all spread out throughout the area, and this one is across the lake, accessible only by canoe. The counselor said that one of her kids was losing his mind. Getting information over the radios is really hard, since they're just short range and the signal cuts out after a certain distance. From what we could understand though, the kid said he met someone in the woods who tried to get him to come with him. He got too scared and ran and told his counselor and had almost ran away several times while they tried to calm him down. Now, I should mention that a lot of these kids can be trouble. They act up for attention and can be a real handful sometimes. But this particular kid was one of the quiet, sweet ones. He was only 9 and just this shy little goofball who, if you paid any attention to, would talk your ear off about his favorite dinosaurs and TV shows. He hadn't given any of us any problems all week and was actually starting to make friends at this point. It was really hard for him to be social with other kids. So basically with these kids, we take everything with a grain of salt. So a story like this isn't enough to make us call the police, especially since the nearest police station is 40 minutes away. So we talk and decide that maybe this kid should come spend the night back in the main cabin. Kids sleep in there all the time when they're having problems. It's pretty routine. One of the cooks who stayed behind says he'll come with me and get the kid. I had to go. It was part of my job. we start to walk down through the woods to the docks where all the canoes are tied up. It's a calm night, and nothing is really moving in the woods. The stars are out, and everything is still. The forest in this area can be pretty creepy at night, so I'm glad I have company. When all you have to see is a small flashlight, it can feel like you're surrounded by darkness, and that there's something always moving off to the edges of your vision as the light casts off every branch and stump. We get to the shore, grab some paddles, and hop in one of the canoes. The water is so calm that it looks like a mirror reflecting back the stars. As we get closer, we can see that there are lights on in the campsite. We make our way across the lake, then come up to the shore. All of the counselors are sitting on the shore with their flashlights pointed back into the woods, completely lighting up all the trees. The kid is huddled up behind them, sobbing and muttering to himself. We dock and start jokingly trying to figure out what they're all doing, asking if they're expecting someone to come walking out of the trees. But they don't laugh. The younger counselors, who are only 15 themselves, tell us that while they were trying to calm the kid down, he started panicking, shouting that she was coming to take him away, and telling them that he knew she was in the trees. The head counselor took me aside and said that they had seen something walking between the tents. But when they all turned their flashlights on, they couldn't see anything. She was trying to stay calm and not let on how scared she was. But her pupils were enormous, and her hands were shaking a bit. The whole time, the cook who came with us had been trying to calm this kid down, who wouldn't stop freaking out since we got there. He had wet his pants at this point, but hadn't seemed to notice. I asked the counselor if she thought she'd be okay spending the night, and she assured me that it's probably nothing, just the woods playing tricks on them. I tried to make a case that it was totally possible there was someone in the woods, and that maybe it wasn't safe to stay out, but she was adamant that it was in her head. Plus, waking up all the kids in the middle of the night, packing up camp, and canoeing back across the lake with them just wasn't practical, she said. My boss would have killed us if we had done something like that, just because some 9-year-old kid had a bad dream. So, we decided instead that we should take this kid back and let him sleep inside a building so he can relax. Myself, the cook, and this kid climb into the canoe, and after one last time to make sure things were okay, set off back across the lake. Once we were out in the middle of the water, the kid seemed to calm down. We tried talking to him, and he seemed to relax a bit. He began telling us about the woman he saw. He said that he had woken up because he thought he heard his mother calling him out of the woods. He got out of his tent and walked a bit back, and said that he had seen a woman standing there. He said she was really tall and skinny, and that her hair was messy, and that it covered her face. He said she had antlers like a deer. She had asked him to help her in the woods, and when he had refused, she got mad. She had started to walk towards him, and he had got scared and ran across and started forcing his way into the counselor tent. We joked that sometimes the woods can make you see stuff, and maybe it was all just a dream. He pushed back against this idea at first, but then said that maybe we were right. He was pretty mature for his age, and I think he was starting to get a bit embarrassed about wetting his pants. He started to downplay the whole situation a bit. When we were about 40 meters from the shore, the cook, who was sitting at the front of the canoe, flipped on his flashlight so we could see the dock. The kid immediately lost his mind. He said that she was on the shore, with her hands outstretched to him. He started shrieking like I have never heard before. It was like he was being tortured, pure fear and adrenaline. He had no idea what to do and stood up, almost tipping our canoe over. He screamed, "Go back! Go back!" at the top of his lungs and tried to walk to the back of the canoe. We stopped paddling and tried to calm him down, but it wasn't working. He rocked us really bad, and I worried that we were all about to go overboard. I told him we would go back if he would just sit down. He did, but he didn't stop pleading with us to make her go away. And what was more, he kept shouting that she would never have him. We paddled backwards and started heading for the alternate boat launch, further down the water. I tried to talk to him, but he's beyond reasoning. I tried to talk to the cook, but he wasn't responding to me either. He stopped paddling, so I struggled to move us all by myself. Eventually, he put his oar into the water, but he still wouldn't respond to me. We paddled back down, and when we got back to the shore, I had to remind the cook to turn the flashlight on so we didn't hit any of the rocks. He hesitated, but eventually turned it on. The kid was still scared at me, but gratefully he didn't see anything as we docked. The alternate boat launch was still farther up the road from the camp, so we had about a 10-minute walk along the gravel road to get back to the camp. The kid gripped my arm as hard as he could, and I basically had to drag him up the road. Now up until this point, I had been pretty relaxed about everything. It had all been a bit unnerving, but my job is to be calm, to be the rational one in emergency situations, so I made it my responsibility to be a calming presence for the kid. But when we were about halfway back, things changed. The kid stopped in his tracks and asked if we heard her. I entertained the idea and stopped to listen, just to try and reassure him that I didn't hear the same thing that he did. But when I strained my ears, I did hear something. I can't fully describe it. It was something of a sort of humming noise, but much softer. It had a cadence like a person speaking, but I couldn't hear any words. It sort of swelled and got quieter. I looked at the cook, and he was now visibly afraid. The sound started to get louder, and it seemed to be coming from all directions. It had a rhythm like breathing, and the air seemed to vibrate with it. The kid started to bolt, and the cook was right behind him. I followed close behind, feeling the noise rising behind me and getting closer. The cook literally picked the kid up off his feet and ran with him in his arms because the kid couldn't keep pace. We came up to the camp, and the cook ran straight for the main cabin. He threw the door open and tried to slam it in my face, but I pushed through, and he closed it behind me. The others hadn't waited up for us, and the cabin was pretty empty. We were all panting, and the kid was now wheezing from crying so much. We coaxed him into the infirmary to try and get him a spare set of sheets and pillow to let him sleep on the cot in there, but he asked us not to go. We told him that we would be right outside the door if he got scared. The two of us sat at the table in the mess hall. Neither of us spoke to the other right away. After a minute, the cook looked up at me and told me he saw something down at the water's edge. I asked him what it was, what he had seen, and he said it was like a silhouette on the dock. He said it was big and pure black, and that the light from the flashlight seemed to pour into it. He asked if I saw it too, and I told him I hadn't seen anything. I told him that all I heard was a humming noise. But he was confused. He said he didn't hear the humming. He said he heard a person. He said it was like a distant call at first, but quickly got so close that he thought it was right next to him. He said it was a voice, but speaking without any tone or rhythm, that the words were just nonsense, like hearing a language you don't understand. And it sounded like a woman. We stayed up the entire night in the mess hall. Neither of us wanted to go outside and walk back to the cabins. We didn't mention any of this other stuff to the other counselors from the lake. One of the counselors said that after we left, nothing weird happened that night, and that she had mostly forgotten about what had happened at her campsite the last night. The kid begged us to let him go home, but we ended up making him stay. He would not stop talking about what had happened, but we eventually had to make him stop because he was scaring all of the other campers. He clung to the counselor at all times and never let them out of his sight for the rest of the week. I really can't account for what happened that night. Nothing like that has ever happened to me after. I even went back for a second summer, and nothing similar happened. But I know what I heard that night. I have no idea what could have made that noise. But I do know that it was the most unnatural sound I have ever heard. The kid didn't come back the second summer, and neither did the cook. I saw him a year later while out at the bar, and after some chatting and catching up, I brought up what happened that night. He got really upset and stormed away and didn't talk to me for the rest of the night. I think he really believes what he saw out there, but I don't know what to believe about it.